Here they come again. Oh.
Prepare to charge!
Oh, really? Against that lot? Really?
You mean it?
Oh.
Oh, really?
Oh. Come on,
Okay.
hurry up now. Let's go. Ready? Okay, let's go.
As we have seen, musketry in 1914 was a complex subject. All the training that the man undertook throughout the year would lead to one goal: the passing of his annual qualification. The annual qualification was broken into 6 parts. Part 1 was known as the qualification practices. Part 2, the instructional practices. Part 3, the classification practices. Part 4, the individual field practices. Part 5, the fire direction practices. And Part 6, the collective field practices. Parts 1 to 3 were shot on what was known as a conventional range. This consisted of a series of firing points, typically spaced at 100 yards from the targets. Stationed to these targets were a series of men. Their responsibility was to score, pull, patch, and operate the target mechanisms. The shooting in parts 1 to 3 could loosely be grouped into 4 different categories: grouping, application, snap, and rapid shooting. Shooting was conducted out to 600 yards, and by far the most important part of the annual qualification were the practices that were grouped together in Part 3, the classification practices. For it was the aggregate score of these practices that would gain the man 2 things. 1, his status as marksman, first, second, or third class shot, as well as his proficiency pay. The field firing practices, 4, 5, and 6, were shot not on the conventional range, but out in the training area. Field firing gave the man an opportunity to practice, shall we say, a more tactical style of shooting. Unknown ranges, multiple targets, both as an individual and as a group. Field firing had been part of the musketry program since Victorian times, albeit in a rudimentary form. By 1914, it had become much more complex. So, having conducted their preliminary training in barracks and the miniature and 30 yards ranges, typically individual companies would be sent to the range to conduct their annual musketry qualification. In this video, we'll shoot the first 3 parts of the annual qualification, compare our scores to the historical standard, and see how we do. Parts 1 to 5 were shot in what was known as drill order, that is to say ammunition pouches and bayonet only. Part 6 was shot in what was known as marching order. What? You're kidding. I just got all this stripped down. Really? It seems that the colonel fancies himself a bit of a hard ass. Apparently, we're going to be shooting the entire annual qualification in marching order. Anyway, welcome to Stone Forest Ranges. Let's see how we do. Now, it was originally the plan to have the entire annual qualification featured in one video, but very quickly it soon became apparent that this would not be possible. The sheer volume of shooting and the attention required to present it in an effective way would render a video that would be so long as to be unwatchable. Therefore, this subject, Part 3 of the musketry series, the annual qualification, will be broken itself into a number of parts. Part 3A, B, C, and so on. So, in this video, Part 3A of Musketry of 1914 will cover the background and scoring of the annual qualification and the shooting of Part 1, the qualifying practices. So far, the musketry series has brought us through some history and background to the musketry program as used in 1914, an outline of the targetry and preliminary training. The program was instituted in 1909 and was immediately surrounded by speculation and trepidation due to the perceived difficulty over the previous program developed in the immediate aftermath of the Boer War. Many examples exist in regimental journals and the like as to the alarm that it brought on the troops. Chiefly, it was thought that by being so difficult, one might run the risk of not scoring well and thereby losing one's proficiency pay, which could be quite considerable. Time would show that the new musketry parameters would be eminently achievable. The practices and details regarding their execution were all found in Part 1 of the Musketry Manual of 1909, which itself was revised in 1914. Now, it's far beyond the scope of this video to walk through the entire book, but rather pertinent parts will be referred to as required. In Appendix 1, there were 2 tables, A and B. These outline the various shooting practices for recruits, Table A, and trained soldiers, Table B. Table B will obviously be the focus for this and subsequent videos. Within Table B, there were a series of 25 practices which were designed to test in a comprehensive way aspects pertinent to battlefield musketry. It was shot by the infantry, the cavalry, and an abridged version was shot by the Royal Engineers. These 25 practices were, as mentioned in the introduction, broken into 3 parts, 1 through 3. Part 1, the qualifying practices, was the gateway to the rest of the program. 6 simple practices from 100 to 500 yards tested basic skills and confirmed that the preliminary training, both theory and practical, had been learnt and could be demonstrated. Part 2 was termed the instructional practices. These were 11 practices intended to develop all nuances of battlefield musketry. Extensive use of cover on the firing point, shooting with fixed bayonets, and the critical techniques of snap and rapid shooting, including the use of moving targets, were all covered in detail. These practices were shot from 200 to 600 yards. Part 3, or the classification practices, was perhaps the most critical section. It consisted of 8 practices, following similar lines to those already shot from 100 to 600 yards. As mentioned, it was these practices that the man would be judged for his status as a shot, and resultingly the amount, if any, of his proficiency pay. These first 3 parts were all shot on the conventional range, but the subsequent 3 parts, 4, 5, and 6, were shot out in the training area. Part 4, or the individual field practices, saw individual men cycle through courses of fire designed to take the skills demonstrated in Parts 1 to 3 and apply them in a more tactical setting. Shooting while defending and attacking were to form the core skills practiced. Part 5, termed the fire direction practices, weren't so much for all, but rather NCOs and officers to practice the direction and application of fire, practice commands, and managing ammunition expenditure by selecting appropriate rates of fire. Part 6, or the collective field practices, were similar to the individual practices of Part 4, but executed as a section under an NCO or officer. Again, defense and attack schemes figured prominently. Ammunition for the annual qualification was broken down thus. For Part 1, 30 rounds were allotted. 60 for Part 2, 50 for Part 3, 35 for Part 4, and 50 for Part 6. To this total was added 25 surplus rounds. Although allotted per man, they were held in reserve to enable reshoots for failures, testing, and importantly, these rounds were used for the shooting of Part 5, the fire direction practices. These, not shot by all, and therefore with no specific number of rounds allotted, it was recommended that 300 or so be drawn from the surplus for the execution of this part. This gave a total of 250 rounds allotted per man, although only 225 of these were guaranteed to be his to shoot. The ammunition that I used for these practices is the same loading that I use for all my SMLE shooting. It mimics the Mark VI ammunition in velocity and bullet weight. Although typically used with earlier versions of the Lee Enfield and Lee Metford, here with making a small adjustment to the seating depth, making the overall length shorter, it works just fine in the SMLE. Although there were 25 practices in the annual qualification, these weren't all shot in one fell swoop. The recommendation was that only 15 rounds per day per man were to be shot. If shooting the classification practices, or Part 3, 25 rounds was the recommended number. With that stipulation, it would take at least 2 weeks for a company, typically 50 to 80 men, to cycle through and complete their musketry qualification. In the execution of some of the practices, namely those of Part 2, there was some degree of flexibility afforded most levels of command, both company and battalion. These could be shot in a different order than prescribed in the table, or even changed in detail, as long as they remained in similar spirit, and did not purposely mimic the practices of Part 3. Now, there is a caveat that needs to be mentioned here in relation to this video. As you might understand, completion of this project in particular has been a colossal undertaking. Without the luxury of dedicated time and facilities to conduct the annual qualification, my approach to the practices was very much driven by the completion of practices grouped by their range rather than their prescribed organization in Table B. For example, this meant that I shot all the 100-yard practices at the same outing, whether they were from Part 1, 2, or 3. This, of course, would not be the case historically. Each part was shot to its conclusion before moving on to the subsequent part. The method I used, therefore, relied a bit on faith that I would meet the minimum requirements for each part when it all came out in the wash. For this reason, too, you will see throughout the practices different locations, times of day, and even weather featured as I moved from outing to outing, completing the different practices. I hope that you could forgive this somewhat ahistorical approach in sequencing, and a certain degree of lack of continuity. Although covered in Part 2 of the Musketry series, a small review of the targetry used in the various parts of the annual qualification might be in order. For Parts 1 to 3, the following targets were used. The most simple was the 4-foot by 4-foot second class elementary target. There were 2 other screen targets in the 6x6 first class and the 4x4 second class figure targets, used extensively. Added to this were 2 standalone figure targets, the number 3 and the number 6. For Parts 4, 5, and 6, the whole range of figure targets could be used as the designers of the ranges saw fit. These parts could also include the use of falling plates, disappearing, and moving targets, mostly based on existing figure targets. Scoring of the targets played a critical role in assessment of performance and was conducted thus. Although relatively straightforward, there were subtle differences between targets and even the same target in different practices. In regards to the second class elementary target, scoring was thus. For grouping practices, a portable set of rings was used to measure group size, and therefore the target itself wasn't necessarily applicable. For application shooting, the target was divided in the following way. For scoring, a 12-inch ring was considered the bull, although this was invisible from the firing point, the 8-inch aiming mark being set inside that. Hits inside the 12-inch ring were considered to be worth 4 points. Within the 24-inch ring, hits were worth 3 points, and the rest of the target was worth 2. There were 2 classes of figure targets, both used extensively. These were scored identically, notwithstanding the differing dimensions of the figure, rings, and overall size. As it was used most, the second-class figure target will be the one used to demonstrate the system of scoring. For application and most rapid shooting, the central number 5 figure scored 4 points, the inner 3, the magpie 2, and the outer, or the rest of the target, was worth 1 point. For snap shooting, there were subtle differences. The figure was worth 4 points, the inner 3, the magpie 2, but here, in snap shooting, the outer was scored as a miss, yielding a score of 0. Specific scoring was used for practice 22, the rapid shoot at 300 yards. Here, the figure and inner were combined, all hits therein yielding 3 points. The magpie and outer were the same as for application shooting. For the figure number 3 and the figure number 6, both used in the annual qualification, they were scored by either hit or miss, with hits scoring 3 points per. The 4-foot targets, namely the second-class elementary and the second-class figure targets, were mounted on a frame, which either rose up and down or was rotated. The individual figure targets, however, namely the 3 and the 6, they were mounted on a stick for presentation above the burn in the butts. Obviously, scoring was intimately tied to performance. To this end, there were a number of criteria required in each part that needed to be attained in order to pass to the next. For Part 1, a twofold standard was used. To pass the qualifying practices, a score of 15 points was required in both Practice 1 and 4. as well a total score of no less than 45 in the remaining practices 2, 3, 5, and 6. Failure of Part 1 resulted in a rather convoluted remedial training program. First, the man shot practices 7 to 14 of Part 2. Then he repeated the practices of Part 1 in which he failed. Once this process was repeated twice and still no success, the man was deemed a third-class shot and did not fire Part 3, but did fire Part 6 if ammunition was available. He then, of course, being deemed a third-class shot, did not qualify for his proficiency pay. In Part 2, there was, most interestingly, no score that needed to be attained to pass to Part 3. This was only for trained soldiers, however. For recruits, a score of 90 points was needed to continue on to Part 3. Part 3, of course, was the truly important set of practices. To be classed as a marksman, a score of 130 or greater was required. A first-class shot scored between 129 points and 105. All those who scored 50 points in practices 18 to 22 inclusive, or 70 points in Part 3 complete, were deemed second-class shots. All those who did not attain the standard of second class were deemed third-class shots and did not qualify for their proficiency pay. There was no specific standard for Parts 4, 5, and 6, although the system of scoring for figure targets would be used to judge effectiveness, if only for the man's own instruction or comparison with others or other groups, squads, or companies. So, with all preliminary training and range work complete, the men, typically by company, would be sent to the range to begin their annual qualification with Part 1, the qualifying practices. Practice 1 consisted of a 5-round grouping, lying, supported with a rest at 100 yards. The target was the second-class elementary target.
With 5 rounds, load!
Ranges were a highly controlled environment. Briefings and instructions would have been issued, and strict adherence to words of command and even pedantic progression through the practices ensured everything was properly regulated.
At 100! At the second-class elementary target! 5 rounds grouping. Fire!
As we progress through the practices, for ease of presentation, each target will be shown after completion of the practice, and a running tally of the score will be provided.
So, practice number 1, which was 5-round grouping at 100 yards. Point of aim was the bottom of the black, right here, and the rounds were hitting slightly high, 4 within about 4 inches, and 1 flyer, which puts me in the 8-inch category.
Well, not particularly an auspicious start, but good enough for the 8-inch category, 20 points. Practice 2 was a 5-round application, lying, supported by a rest at 200 yards. The target was the second-class elementary target. As with grouping, the purpose here, in application shooting, was to take as much time as required to achieve the best results. That said, for all slow fire, or application fire, 20 seconds was generally considered to be the time taken with each shot.
Well, not too bad for 200 yards. 4 rounds a bit low here, and 1 a bit high. Now the difference between application and grouping, this being an application practice, is that here you're trying to hit the target versus simply trying to get a good group. So the aiming mark is 8 inches. The scoring ring is 12 inches with an inner of 24. 1, 2, 3, 4 within the 12-inch and 1 just outside.
With the 4 hits inside the 12 ring and 1 just outside, the score for practice 2 is 19. Practice 3 was a 5-round application from the kneeling supported position at 300 yards. It was shot at a second-class figure target. Although little detail of what a rest for the kneeling position looked like, mine is somewhat ad hoc. Please excuse the somewhat ahistorical plastic table used as a support. An interesting point about this position is that it's actually quite difficult to find an appropriate height to have the rest placed. Here I had to do a little fine-tuning so that the rifle would be supported without undue strain or having to reach higher and lower and still maintain a stable fire position.
So practice number 3, a 5-round application from 300 for the kneeling supported. Not particularly good on this one. 1, 2, 3, just off to the left here. 1 in the figure, and oh yeah, 1 way down there, just inside the magpie ring. So that's a total of 15 for this.
So far, so good. Practice 4 was a 5-round grouping, lying, but this time unsupported at 100 yards. It was shot at a second-class elementary target. The only difference between this practice and practice number 1 was the lack of a rest. This is a good example of how the difficulty of practices tended to increase as the men progressed through the various parts.
I never cease to disappoint myself. 4 rounds in under 2 inches, and the 5th makes it 7 inches. Still underneath the 8-inch limit, giving me 20 points for this grouping.
So, 20 points. Too bad about that one flyer though. It does, however, make a passing mark for this practice. Practice 5 was a 5-round application, lying unsupported at 400 yards. It was shot at the larger first-class figure target. This was ordinarily, in the remainder of the program, shot at ranges of between 500 and 600 yards. However, here in the qualifying practices, it was used at 400, as perhaps an introduction and therefore a more manageable experience as the men progressed to these longer ranges. In the remainder of the program, 400-yard practices were shot at the second-class figure target.
So, practice number 5, at the rather monstrous first-class figure target. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 shanked into the figure here. So that is a total score of 16.
I always seem to include a flyer in the groupings. The score of 16 raises the total to 50 points. At this point, technically, after the completion of practice 5, I've already passed part 1, with 1 practice left to go. Practice 6 was a 5-round application, lying with the side of the rifle rested at 500 yards. It was shot at the first-class figure target, which, despite its size, is starting to look pretty small by this range. You can see here the technique of resting the side of the rifle while shooting. By holding the forestock in the hand and placing the hand braced against the object, I found this most comfortable. This technique was a critical aspect of shooting around cover, as shown. While not perhaps as stable as with a rest placed underneath the weapon, it nevertheless provides much appreciated stability.
Practice number 6, a 5-round application from 500 yards with the side of the rifle rested in a lying position. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Just squeaked 1 in there. So that's a total of 15 points. Not my best shooting, but with light fading, that is the end of the qualifying practices. Let's see how we do.
With all the practices of part 1 shot, the scoring is as follows. I attained 20 points each in practices 1 and 4, bettering the minimum standard of 15. For the remainder, an aggregate score of 45 was needed to pass. I managed 65. Taken together with the grouping scores, I've attained a solid pass, enabling me to progress to the instructional practices, Part 2. So ends Part 3A of the Musketry series. We covered some background to the annual qualification, the system of targets and scoring used, and we demonstrated the shooting of Part 1, the qualifying practices. Although not particularly comprehensive, their successful completion served as a gateway to subsequent and more challenging shooting. In the next video, Part 3B of the Musketry series, we'll show the instructional practices of Part 2 of the Annual Qualification. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below.